Welcome to Idiot with a Library Card. Podcast by me, Bennett. Have you ever had a fever dream? Have you ever had a high fever? Or, in my case, one of my most vivid fever dreams was, actually it's happened twice to me. They're pretty intense experiences. I've taken psychedelics, and it has that sort of feel to it, these fever dreams. But without the joyousness of mushrooms or MDMA or acid, they're different, but in that they're intense and you hallucinate sometimes. But I've never heard anyone say, that was a lovely fever dream. So they're intense and kind of scary. I think your body knows something's wrong and your mind knows, but it can't quite place it. So I read Heart of Darkness. I really liked it. It's a very beautiful book, and I haven't read a beautiful book in a while. I'm not a big fan of poetry. I can't sit down and read a book of poetry. I can read a poem and go, oh, that was nice. But generally, even then, I'm not a fan of poetry. This is how I like poetry, though. If you could call it poetry, is Heart of Darkness has little poems in it. It's sort of a poetic book, and a lot of it's beautifully written, and I really, really liked it. So, but back to fever dreams. The book sort of feels like a fever dream. There are points, the timeline always seems disconnected. I personally at times felt a little lost reading it. I had to go back and reread some passages to understand what's going on, and you just have these moments where the timeline of the story seems disconnected. And the other thing is, with a fever dream, you generally feel separated from your body. And in this story, in this book, you're separated from the story. There's like another layer there, in that most books are written and you're in the story. The story is happening around you. A narrator is telling the story, but you feel like while it's going on. Where this book is being told by someone on a boat, and he's telling the story of looking for Mr. Kurtz. And so you're a little further away. There's like another level of separation between you and the story. And it's an interesting device used. I haven't read why Joseph Conrad decided to go in that direction. But it does something interesting to the story. It makes it feel disconnected, and at times you have these, he's talking in the present. Again, it's sort of what makes this, I'm going to keep using the term fever dream, it's what makes it feel like that, is that at times he'll break from the story and say something to the other guys he's out on a boat with, and explain something or ask them for a cigarette or something like that. And it sort of it has a separating quality to it, which makes the story really interesting. Now, Marlowe is the narrator, and he's telling the story. He is a steamboat captain who is working for something called the Company, and he's not naturally a steamboat captain. He's generally a captain of seafaring vessels. But this is a steamboat that goes, it's a river steamboat. And he goes to Africa. They have to fix up his boat for a while, which is interesting. And you keep hearing about this Mr. Kurtz fella who owns operates one of the I guess I would call it agencies, sort of storefronts where they get ivory. Ivory is what this company trades. And Mr. Kurtz has done an amazing job. He has gathered the most ivory. He's running laps on everyone. And the whole time you're sort of, Mr. Kurtz is coming. He's coming. And you do eventually meet him. The thing is, I won't say I was disappointed with Mr. Kurtz himself. It's an interesting character for sure, and one of literature's greatest. But I love the book before you meet him, because you get to sort of pretend with the narrator on what's going on. You have an idea of that he's going to be kind of crazy, and that when they find him, things are not going to be well, and that is true. But the build up to meeting him is so exciting, and you just they tease it out for, I would say, more than half the book. They tease it out, and then you meet him, and it's like, whoa. You know, you think he's dead. You're pretty sure he's not dead. Maybe you thought he was dead if you picked up this book, I don't know, at the turn of the century when it's written. I think it was 1898, but don't quote me on that. Also, what I appreciate about the book is it is very tightly written. The story moves along fast. This is a pretty short book. The story moves along pretty fast. But as fast as it moves, it does a good job of sort of building the suspense, telling the story, and giving you really interesting and beautiful detail at the same time in a very tight book. And I always appreciate a tight book. I can read a long book and I enjoy it, but when it gets sort of frivolous and there's too much of one thing, too much of building suspense or too much, it's hard to say too much storytelling, but I don't like books with too much story. I mean, I did a show on Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is like the limit of too much story. I mean, there's a lot of detail woven into Lord of the Rings, a lot of back lore and all that, and that stuff's interesting to me. But I've never read J.R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones. I feel like that would fall in. I look at the size of those books and I go, "Are you kidding me?" I almost feel the Dark Tower series is sort of like that too. I've read a few of those books, and there just feels like there is too much story there. But hey, some people are like that. If you're enthralled in that world, you can never get enough story. It's what they're doing to things like Star Wars. You now have too much story for Star Wars. Like I used to be able to explain to my daughter what Star Wars was all about, and although she's seen all the movies and loves them, I couldn't do it now. I couldn't be like, okay, well, you know, and so I like tight books, and this book is tight. It's really tight, and not like, "That's tight, man." The kids still say tight as in cool. I think we did. Maybe. I don't remember if I did. I'm going to say I didn't. I probably tried it once, 3 months too late, and everyone looked at me like, lame. So, that's the story of my life. Now, the other thing, I didn't do much research for this episode. I generally don't. I think you could read this book as racist. Maybe? Well, no, not maybe. I mean, it's not very nice to black folks. It doesn't paint them in a very flattering light, I should say. But there's some interesting passages, and the white supremacist movement has tried to say, oh, well, Western culture is great because white people did it, and it's certainly not so. So one of the interesting dynamics he does early on in the book, maybe to say, hey, this isn't racist, but it might sound it, is he talks about England when the Romans landed there and how the English were looked at as savages at the time, and they sort of, through Roman culture, bettered themselves. And you kind of feel like if you were a tribe isolated in the woods and had no contact with other people, you'd be savages. And it's not a race thing then. But I just love the dynamic, the constant dynamic of comparing ancient times to now, and sort of the build of culture and what it does. So one of my favorite passages is early on in the book, so bear with me. "I was thinking of very old times, when the Romans first came here, 1900 years ago, the other day." Love that. "Light came out of this river since, you say nights? Yes. But it is like a running blaze on a plain like a flash of lightning in the clouds. We live in the flicker. May it last as long as the old earth keeps rolling. But darkness was here yesterday. Imagine the feeling of a commander of a fine, what do you call them? Trireme in the Mediterranean, ordered suddenly to the north. Run overland, across the Gauls, in a hurry. Put in charge of one of these craft, the legionaries. A wonderful lot of handy men they must have been too. Used to build apparently by the hundreds in a month or two. If we may believe what we read, imagine him here, the very end of the world. I love it. And it's just interesting that times change, but things are still the same. I enjoyed that passage. I enjoyed the whole imagery of it. It's much longer, the passage. I read the beginning of it, but it's a good read just for that passage. It's right in the beginning of the book. So if you just want to read that part, it's very well written sort of prologue to what the story is going to be about. I love the time jump, saying, that when the Romans came to England was yesterday, and in sort of the history of the world, the natural history of the world, it was yesterday. And it's just it's so cool to think that way. What it does is it brings humankind together, that we're really not all that different. It's circumstances and, well, I mean, there's all sorts of arguments as to why cultures develop differently. Environment, obviously, is a huge part of it, but just time and a lot of it is, if you look at sort of the more successful civilizations, it's because they ran into other civilizations. But this podcast is not about that. And so the description of the natives is not overly flattering, I would say. There's a lot of pity taken on them, and I mean, you could take that how you want it. When he arrives at the first station, he describes the slavery and how the white people there sort of justify it as these people are criminals. They're clearly not criminals. They're slaves, and how mistreated they are. They're basically worked to death, not fed. And he sees all these, there's like a pit of dead, and some of them aren't even dead in this pit. So that's a really upsetting part. The book, and I've read a few people sort of hinting that it's a racist book. I don't know about that. The natives are not described in a flattering light, but I think it's more that they're simple and primitive, and they are. That's not necessarily a racist statement that those parts of Africa have very simple and primitive cultures. It's sort of how it turned out. I don't think it's I think sometimes we conflate racism with, I don't know if you'd call it even culturalism, sort of a cultural superiority, like white supremacists against maybe like a cultural supremacist, and some people use that and will let the two bleed together, which is not good. I don't think black folks are naturally dumber or can't live in a society or naturally servitudal. Their nature doesn't naturally point them towards servitude, I guess is how the best way to say it. I'm leaving that last part in, note to self, so you can see how much of an idiot with a library card I am. But back to the book, is there's a balance. I think if you read it sort of, if you read it with no symbolism and read it straightforward and don't stop to think about it, I think you can look at it and go, "Oh, this book is racist." But I don't take it that way. And so just to clarify that. And I think some of the descriptions of the natives can be quite beautiful, and sort of the symbolism and actually he does, and sometimes he does sort of clarify in the beginning of the book with the comparison of the Romans going up to Britain. He almost uses this isn't a racist book, that there isn't much of a difference, and what's happening to the people in Africa is wrong. I think you can make those distinctions and draw those conclusions from the book. But he also uses the word nigger a lot, and savage. So, there's a balance there. But I'm trying to remember. I'd have to actually go through the whole book. I don't know if he does that describing the native people of Africa, or he has other people using that language. I'll have to go back and check. But I did go back and check, and it looks like not. It looks like he does not do that. So the book is not racist. I just want to pull that there are some sort of views at the turn of the century and views about colonial Africa that are negative towards the people. But again, he does preface it with that story of the Roman coming to England, and you have to be careful when you have someone go, well, I'm not racist, but, because anytime you hear that, I've worked with people or been with people who will say something like, I'm not racist, and then they are about to say something super racist, and they probably are a little racist when they need to preface it that they're not racist. But so this book does do that, preface it, but I don't take it as racist. It's, I'm not racist, and I'm going to say something that's not racist, but could be interpreted that way. Back to more of the book. I love the little stories. It's what is also cool. I described it as a fever dream earlier, but it also has that now. And I've never been on a boat overnight, so I assume it's much like going camping and sitting around the campfire and talking, where someone will tell a story, and contained in that story, especially if they're telling a long story and it's a good story, you love when someone gets going. I've known people very close to me that they can tell a story and they can mix in 3 or 4 other great stories that would be good stories on their own. I particularly, in this book, love sort of the story of him in, I think it's Amsterdam, it's a city in Holland, where he meets the doctor, and sort of the boat trip, and these little vignette stories. The accountant is a really interesting story where he has this meticulously kept office, and he is meticulously kept. His hair is perfect. His dress is on point every day, although he lives in a tropical jungle, not desert, but he keeps everything together. While all that suffering of the people at that first station is going on. And yet he, and there's a nice contrast there that he does. I love this story, and sort of there isn't much comedic breakup. And the story ends up becoming tragic because the guy dies, I think, of malaria. I mean, it's sort of inferred, but the guy who faints every day, like they always know he's gonna faint. They try to slow him down. He says, "No, I'm all right," and then he faints, and they have to carry him some ways. But he keeps doing it. He does it like every time they have to travel anywhere. I do really enjoy that little story. It was comedically broken up, but like this whole book, there isn't much joy in it, and he dies of malaria. But, it's hard to feel bad for a lot of the white folks there. They're there just to make money. They're lazy and the brick maker that doesn't make any bricks. It's just the whole story. The colonialists there are just ugh, and I assume that's how a lot of colonialists were back then. I don't know. I didn't know any. I don't know any colonialists, but they're there for profit. They don't care about anything but money and ivory, and they want profit, but they don't really want to sacrifice for it or work for it. They sort of want to go and find ivory and have the natives take care of everything else. So, but I do like the little breakups, the little stories within the story, and some of it drives to the point. Again, it's a very tight book, so there isn't much room for flights of fancy in this book, but it does happen occasionally. And I also like the symbolism of the boat, sort of being a broken down boat, and I picture it going down the river Styx, and it does. The whole story sort of has that, like most great epics, going down to hell and then coming back again, and sort of what that does to a person. But the whole, they're heading somewhere dark and terrible, and the story doesn't beat around the bush. They're going in that direction. Big wheel keeps on turning, and whatever the boat's called keeps on burning. But they end up rolling down the river, and the inevitable sort of hell they're going to is really interesting. The last two things I'm going to get to, I love the buildup of going to see Kurt. They're going to go see him. They're sort of, he might be dead, but he's not. He's not dead. He meets him. And through, I would say, the first half to 2/3 of the book, it's just the buildup to this guy. And you get there, and I don't know, it's disappointing. And I don't know if it's supposed to be disappointing, but I think it is supposed to be disappointing. He's sick now and crazy, which you expect. You expect him to be kind of crazy, but he's sort of sick and sad, and that it's just the whole book. The build up to meeting him is really it makes you want to read the next page. Like, when are they going to meet this guy? How awesome and great is he? And how interesting is he going to be? I actually don't really enjoy the second. It's probably a little less than the second half of the book. I don't love when they get there, and then the boat ride back is okay. The story winds down instead of you hit the climax, and to me the story winds down after that. Kirk's put a bunch of heads on pikes, and he's clearly gone mad, and the natives look at him as a god. And that's all very interesting, but for the most part, it does. I don't know. The ending of the book's fine. It ends basically the way it's supposed to end, and he gets back with all these papers, and people want to read this great man. I mean, they treat him like a prophet. They treat Kurtz like a prophet, which is interesting. And the dichotomy is interesting in that the native people that Kurtz interacts with treat him like a prophet, and when he gets back, when Marlowe gets back, the other Europeans treat Kurtz as a dead prophet, and they want to hear his words and read his writings. And so that dichotomy is interesting. So I'm not trashing the end of the book. It's a great book through and through. I just the ending. It's one of those things. If you sometimes I love reading. Like, a book will entice me, and this book really enticed me for the first half. I probably ripped through it in like a day. Like, I couldn't put it down. I wanted to meet this Kurtz fella. But then after I met him and was a little disappointed, the book became a bit of a chore. Like, I was like, all right, well, I have to finish this book. Because I wanted to see the ending. It's just I wasn't as enthusiastic about it. But the ending is interesting, and it's not a book. It's not a book you can read. I would suggest there are books out there that you can read for sections. Like they're just little bits and pieces that are good to read, and you can kind of throw away the rest of the story. But this book isn't one of it. You have to read it cover to cover to really get the impact of it. But I do like that last sort of prophet analogy that I made. I haven't read anything, so maybe this is a Idiot with a Library Card original insight. Probably not. It's written somewhere that happened. But that's how I looked at it. Marlowe meets his fiancée, who's depressed. He lies. I've heard a lot of reviews make a big deal about him lying to the wife, and I guess because Marlowe talks so much about how important truth is. This is one of those truth debates. Like, what good does it do telling her that his last words were the horror? No good. So, I'm going to wrap this up saying Heart of Darkness, great book, quick read. I would recommend reading it. Not as light and fluffy as Confederacy of Dunces, for sure. It's probably a very dark book, but the title indicates what the book is. The title is not a misrepresentation of the book, but it's a classic. I think most people know it's a classic, but if you haven't read it, I would suggest you do. So that's it for me today. I hope you have a great day.